In this video, we're going to talk about some of the characteristics or structures that are used in classifying animals. And we're going to introduce this topic here and talk about tissues, which are one of the kind of distinguishing characteristics between some different animals. And then in some other videos, we will kind of talk about some of the other defining characteristics of different types of animals. So this is a phylogenetic tree showing the kind of the evolutionary relationships between different types of animals. And as you can see, there are different branches. And so it's kind of like almost like a dichotomous key in that you could start to organize animals based on these different characteristics. So if we start on the left here, we can see that we have the metazoa, which are just basically all animals. And then we can take all animals and we can first divide them into animals that have specialized tissues called the eumetazoa and the animals that do not have specialized tissues. And these animals that don't have specialized tissues are called parazoa. You'll also see the term perifera used for these organisms. And if we follow the line, we can see that these are the sponges. And so sponges are these invertebrate animals that live in the sea. Now, if we follow this line up by the specialized tissues, we then have another branch. And this branch is based on symmetry. And so an animal might have bilateral symmetry, or it may have radial symmetry. And we're going to talk about what each of these terms means later on in this lesson. So if you don't understand what bilateral and radial symmetry means, don't worry, we're going to get to it. So the animals that have a radial symmetry are going to be things like the cnidarians and the comb jellies. And cnidarians are kind of more commonly, we're talking mostly about jellyfish. But technically jellyfish are not fish, so technically they're just called jellies. And this is just kind of an example of an organism in this classification. There are more options out there. And then comb jellies are kind of similar to jellies in that they're made of that like kind of jelly-like substance to them, but they tend to take a little bit more of a kind of a cylindrical look to them, and they typically have these kind of like ridges running down their jelly portions. Now, if we were to look up here at the bilateral symmetry of animals, we can then take this group and further divide their classification into protostomes or deuterostomes. And once again, we're going to talk about those terms in more detail coming up here. But first, looking at the deuterostomes, we have the chordates. And so these are going to be the animals that are vertebrates. So the animals that have a spine and a backbone. This includes things like humans. So really mammals, reptiles, birds, amphibians, etc., etc. Echinoderms are going to be things like sea stars, which once again, you've maybe heard them referred to as starfish, but they're not actually fish. So the more appropriate name for them are sea stars. It also includes things like sea urchins. But if we look up here at our protostomes, we can then further classify them into ecdysozoa or lophotrochozoa. And up here at the ecdysozoa, we have our arthropods, which are going to be things like insects and arachnids. So spiders, insects, things like crabs, etc. And roundworms. And then in the lophotrochozoa, we've got things like flatworms, Flatworms, an example would be something like a tapeworm. Rotifers are these kind of small aquatic animals. Ribbon worms are also a type of marine worm, so found in the ocean. Annelids are things like earthworms. And mollusks are things like snails, oysters, scallops, squid, etc. Oh, and I forgot to mention the roundworms. An example of a roundworm would be something like a nematode. And we're going to talk about all of these organisms in more detail in later lessons. But this is just to show you how we can essentially follow this kind of classification scheme in order to figure out what the different characteristics are. So these different branches on that phylogenetic tree are based on these different classification characteristics. So we can look at things like whether an animal has true tissues or not. We can then look at things like body plan. So do they have radial symmetry or bilateral symmetry? We can also look at some developmental pathways. So basically what happens after reproduction, after fertilization, what happens to that zygote as it goes through embryonic development. And so we're going to look at things like the number of germ layers, the origin of the mouth and anus, the presence or absence of an internal body cavity, and some, potentially different larval types. So let's go ahead and take a look at these tissues here. So there are some animals that do not have specialized tissues. And I know it says derived from embryonic germ layers. We will talk about what those germ layers are in a different video. But essentially, just kind of focus on the fact that they do not have specialized tissues. So they are still made up of cells, they're still eukaryotic cells, but the cells aren't organized in these tissues like you would see in a human. So, for example, our skin is made up of cells that work together to form something called epithelial tissue. So, the group of animals that do not have these specialized tissues are called the parazoa, also known as perifera. And that word parazoa means beside animal. So it is an animal, but it's a very minimal animal. It's often confused as a plant because it is sessile during its adult life, and it's just kind of sitting there. It's a filter feeder, and we'll talk more about it on its own video later on. But this is a picture of sponges in the bottom of the ocean, and if you've ever gotten a natural sponge, this is what it is. It's basically the skeleton or the kind of the leftover tissue from a dead sponge that has been harvested off of the bottom of the ocean. So even though these animals don't have specialized tissues, they do have some specialized cell types. And so not every single cell within this organism is exactly the same. So some of the cells are specialized for feeding, others are specialized for growth, et cetera, et cetera. The eumetazoa, or true animals, are ones that have specialized tissues that derive from these embryonic germ layers, which once again, we'll talk about those in a separate video. And so some examples of these specialized tissues or animals with specialized tissues include cnidaria. So cnidaria refers to the jellies. Remember, it's not actually a fish, so it's just a jelly. Things like ctenophores, which are the comb jellies here. And then bilateria are all the other animals. And so this includes things like insects, but also things like reptiles, amphibians, mammals, humans, et cetera, et cetera. So essentially everything except sponges. So everything except the parazoa, periphera, sponges, whatever you want to call it, belongs to this eumetazoa classification of a true animal with these specialized tissues.